let's tackle the pregnancy fertility thing. So I can tell you about there was a scientist that used to work for Pfizer that brought up this issue. His concern was that the protein syncytin-1 he felt was very homologous to the ACE2 receptor, and therefore either COVID-19 or vaccination against the ACE2 would cause a cross reaction with syncytium, and therefore would reduce fertility and population. And of course, this goes back to a very, very old quote of Bill Gates, who said that, well, we are going to reduce population through vaccination, which is a very kind of head scratching. Why would that do that? And so anyway, this kind of grew legs. But I have some good news for you in that they've looked at the phase 3 trials for the Pfizer, Moderna, and Oxford, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson. And to get into those trials, they had to say that they were not pregnant. So first off, no pregnancy allowed. But as we all know, being in the medical field, accidents happen. And so some of these subjects got into the study, weren't pregnant, but then subsequently got pregnant. And of course, people in the placebo arm got pregnant, and people in the vaccination arm got pregnant. And of course, they were followed to make sure, and we know if they were successful or not successful. And the good news is that there was no difference in terms of ability to get pregnant in those. Well, of course, the numbers are not statistically significant because they're so small, but on the face of it, the numbers are very, very similar in terms of how many people got pregnant in the vaccinated group, how many people got pregnant in the placebo group. And by the way, those two groups were equal size in number. And then when we looked at spontaneous abortions, which are very common, by the way, you may not know, but if you were to track it from inception of conception, about 50 to 60% of conceptions end in some sort of spontaneous abortion. Sometimes the woman doesn't even know it. She just doesn't get pregnant, and you wait for the next month. But when looking at all of those in terms of finding out what happened to those pregnancies that were actually deemed as pregnancies, there's no difference in the numbers. And if you want to get a rolling understanding, if that's something that's really interesting to you, let me refer you to a Twitter account. There's and we actually had her on our MedCram channel. Her name is Dr. Male, ironically, M-A-L-E. She's a female, but she is a reproductive immunologist. So her field is very specific for this question that you're asking about, which is what happens with immunizations and fertility. And she's been following all of these vaccines, and she's been keeping track of this and up to date. And she has a living document where she writes all of this. Her name is Dr. Victoria Male. She's on Twitter. If you find her, she's very active in keeping up to date with all of these issues in terms of reproduction and COVID-19 and the vaccination. And that's where I was able to get a lot of that information. Okay, so that's that. Now, she doesn't admittedly have a lot of information about the MMR and TB, but if you were to tweet her, I'm sure she would give you an answer to that question. We asked her some questions regarding to COVID-19, but she would probably be very helpful with some of those other questions that you're doing. She's, by the way, a professor at the Imperial College in London, but she's very active on Twitter. Your other question, remind me again, what was the other question that you had?
As I said, I'm not from the medical field, so I just entertain myself by reading these articles and trying to understand them. That the climate change, you were talking about the new evolving viruses. So do you think there's any scientific standing beyond this theory going around that the ice caps are melting and new viruses or bacterium that has been frozen for so many years, thousands of them, are going to escape and our bodies are not adapted? And secondly, from a philosophical point of view, I was trying to make sense when you were saying that the best way is to vamp up our immune system. So in that context, can you say it really is nature is getting back to us? It's really going to be fight of the fittest, the survival of the fittest in the incoming future. I'd love to hear your take on these two
Yeah,
things.
that's a very good question. So I am not a climatologist in any sense, way, or short form. But what I would say in terms of my observations, it's interesting that we're debating the increase in the temperature of the environment, and it's something so easy to measure, and yet there's so much debate on it. It just goes to show you that it's hard to get on the same page. Is it possible that the temperature increases are melting the snow caps and allowing viruses to come out? I guess it's possible, but we know where this virus came from. It seems to have come from an ant. Well, I guess that is a bit debate too. Some people believe it came from a lab that escaped, and it's certainly possible. I mean, that could happen. But there was a NPR, and National Public Radio is one of our public broadcasting in the United States. They did a episode on bats in northern China in caves, and there's these massive caves in China where there are just millions and millions of bats that have these viruses that they're harboring, and they tested the human beings that were living in the area, and some of these people go into the caves to harvest the bat droppings because they're very good fertilizer. And there's a whole business associated with that. So they looked at these people that go into the caves and get the fertilizer from the bats. And lo and behold, they had all these antibodies against some of these viruses. They were able to find that these viruses had gotten into the people. The missing link is that these viruses not only have to be able to infect people, but also have to be able to then go on to infect another person. And that's what happened in this case. So in my belief and estimation, and this is just expert opinion here, is I think the most likely source of the next pandemic is not from melting ice caps. I think it's from, and this is really where I come down on it, is we need to rethink our relationship with animals. Living close to animals, eating animals, all of these sorts of things. Because if you look at the world's real critical crises in terms of infections, look at swine flu, right? That jumped from a pig into a human being. Let's look at coronavirus. Ostensibly, it came from a bat or a snake or a wet market.
Bird flu, yeah.
Maybe from a lab. Let's look at Ebola. In West Africa, they like to eat what they call bushmeat. Bushmeat are like monkeys or animals that are in the jungle, and they kill it and they eat it. So a lot of these viruses would not be issues in humans if we had a little bit more distance between us and the animals. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
It does make sense.
So that theory about the Harvard doctor being caught with another NPR news is debunked, right?
Yeah.
That was created in a lab and everything.
Yeah, and there is there's no question that there is a level 4 lab in Wuhan. And so is it possible that this virus got out? People can be sloppy. I think there was a senatorial delegation that went to the Wuhan lab in the years before, and they were concerned about some things. I mean, that doesn't prove anything, but it's not inconceivable that could happen. We have to be open-minded to these sorts of things, that they could have happened. But look, we have plenty of evidence that there's other pandemics that come from animals, and this kind of leads a slightly different topic, which is related to why different countries have different mortality rates. And I'll be the first to tell you that the American diet is, I mean, if you look at the number of people that have died in this pandemic, we're number one, and not in a good way. And I think it has a lot to do with our diet here in the United States. It has a lot to do with what we eat, consume, a lot of processed things. And if you look at other countries of the world that maybe don't have the same infrastructure and yet don't have the same mortality rate as we did, countries like Pakistan, India, they certainly have mortality, but probably to the same degree, they're not eating the same garbage that we are here in the United States. And I think that has an impact on the immune system.
Yeah, and that kind of also explains a bit about even in Pakistan, it has been more severe in the cities as compared to the countryside, where people are on a more natural diet. Over here, we
Absolutely.
still eat junk food on and off, and
Exactly, and one of the things that I'm looking at is, and this is emerging data, high fructose corn syrup. If you were to get a can of Coca-Cola in the United States and look at how it gets sugared, it's going to be high fructose corn syrup, because that's what we produce here in this country, and that's politically what's allowed to happen. If you go to Europe, it's almost certainly going to be cane sugar, which let's say is not great, but it's, you know, it's not as bad as high fructose corn syrup.